In DC, for DC. DC Radio, 96.3 HD4 and DCRadio.gov. You've attended council hearings in person. You've tuned in to our televised proceedings on Channel 13. Now, you have the chance to listen to us on the radio as we demystify the work of the people who do it. This is not a council hearing. This is Hearing the Council with your host, Josh Gibson.
Thank you, deep voice person with a funky backbeat. Indeed, this is not a council hearing. This is Hearing the Council. You can't have a government without a council, so you can't have a government radio station without a council show. This is it. I'm Josh Gibson, Director of Communications for the Council. You may also know me as the Council's voice on social media at Council of DC. We're back with a new episode of Hearing the Council after a break. And apparently during the break, Facebook Live and Zoom decided to not work together super well. So this interview is being recorded, but as you'll already know by the time you hear this, it wasn't on Facebook Live. Our apologies, but it'll still be broadcast on DC Radio, and it will still go out as a podcast. With that administration out of the way, thank you for joining us, Councilmember Christina Henderson at large.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is our first time, I think, talking since the election, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And so how's it going?
Well, it's been a bit of a whirlwind. I think we are in month 4. And I like to joke with my colleague, Janice Lewis-George, that we should get kind of medals because no one anticipates the first week of work will be during an insurrection. And then we follow that with inauguration, and we've been dealing with the COVID vaccine rollout. It has been nonstop ever since January.
Yeah, no, I hear that and I feel that. Well, as most of our listeners know, generally our first interview with each council member is a bit of a biographical deep dive, a bit of a getting to know you kind of thing, so folks can get a sense of where you come from and what makes you tick. So I did a little, research in publicly available biographical information. So we're just going to kind of take a quick walk through your career, and then all our future interviews will be about specific legislation and policies. But I think folks benefit from knowing a bit about their council members.
Got it.
So initially I want to start off. So it sounds like you were an Army brat. You were someone who moved around a great deal in your youth. Talk to us a bit about that. It was your mom who was in the Army.
Yeah, my mom joined the Army when I was in 3rd grade, maybe 2nd grade. It was a long time ago. Anyway, so I was born in New York. And then, from there, things just started to take off and we started to move around and lived in lots of different places. So I went to middle school in North Carolina. I went to high school in Georgia. So it was just kind of a, here and there everywhere, but I never went overseas.
And how did that, how did that come about that after starting a family, your mom entered the military? That doesn't seem like a normal, not normal, but like a kind of itinerary you normally hear about.
Yeah, I think, as with any, young parent who is looking for a different career path and a different way, for her, that was something that she wanted to take on and to do. And she's always had a passion for service. And so, serving our country is, one of the ways that she did that.
That's phenomenal. Now, a question that my daughter's 11, and she suggested that I ask, and I think it's a good one, is when you were in school growing up, what type were you? Were you the nerd, the brain, the jock, the class clown, the, sort of outcast? What kind of stereotypical type were you, or were you your own thing?
So it's kind of a mix. I went to magnet schools, both in middle school and high school. So I think you're kind of a nerd by default in the town where we lived, like by going to Columbus High School. People were like, oh, you're super smart. But like within that, obviously like I took AP courses and those kinds of things, but I was really in the artsy crowd. If that could be what you call a stereotype, if you will. But, I was in chorus. I did marching band. I played the violin in orchestra. I did theater, so it was kind of a mix, but I also was like a cheerleader as well. And so, I did a little bit of everything, but, the bulk of my friends who I still keep in contact with to today from high school, like we were the artsy kids. We were, the creative type.
And actually kind of merging the first two questions, it occurred to me that if you are an Army brat and you're relocating all the time, I'm not saying you would have chosen to do this, but you technically could reinvent yourself because each new place you're landing in, no one knows you. And you could go from being the nerd to the theater kid to the jock,
It does allow for that. It does. But, actually, I think one of the best things in terms of being a military kid is just sort of the ability you have to get to know people very well, very quickly, right? Like I'm not necessarily an introvert, but I didn't have the luxury of doing that because you come into a situation where, you've had classmates who have been together for years, right? Oh, we went to kindergarten together and first grade and all that sort of stuff. And now you're sort of a new person having to find your group, find your way. And you just have to figure out how do you meet new people? How do you talk to them? And I don't have the luxury of 4 years of history with you. So how can we connect very quickly?
Yeah, I can imagine that comes in handy these days.
Mm-hmm.
So after primary school, you went off to Furman University, and folks may know that you were the first Black student body president, I believe.
I was, yes.
But what they might not know about, and hooking back into the arts piece, is that you were with the Pauper Players.
Oh, wow. You really did. You really did dig into the archives.
Hey, it was on your LinkedIn page. It's fair game, okay?
Yeah. So the Pauper Players, it was sort of it was an independent theater group that put on productions and shows, mainly musicals. And so when I was a freshman, I was in ragtime with Pauper Players, which was like an incredible experience. And to be able to do that. And later, I want to say when I was a junior, maybe, I was able to be a director for a smaller production that focused around African-American history and culture and arts. And it was a celebration of that. So, I was able to keep one foot in sort of the arts and creative space, even in college. Yeah.
I did theater in high school. And one of the cool things about theater, and there aren't a lot of other extracurriculars like that, is it really brings together an odd mix of people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Song and dance folks, and you have the folks doing lights, direction, the band. So it's like kind of its own little universe. I don't, on the football team, you have folks who want to play football, but in theater, it's such a cross-cutting group of people. I find it
was a cross-cutting group. And I think too, doing that production as a freshman, you just get to know a lot more people. I got to know a lot of upperclassmen, through that experience.
Yeah, definitely. And apparently the mascot at Furman is the Paladin.
Yes.
This ends the bizarre ancient history part of the interview. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting.
For viewers, that is a fancy word for a knight.
A knight, but with a knight with like a religious flavor, a bit of a religious flavor, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Furman used to be a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. So, when I mentioned that to folks and the idea that I was the first person who was elected student body president, in 2007, at that point, Furman had been around for 182 years. there's race that definitely plays a role. There was a long time where Furman was an all-white institution, as many predominantly white institutions, private institutions, started in that regard. And so, when they broke away from the Southern Baptist Convention, it was a very controversial move, but it was one that, frankly, I'm not sure I would have found Furman if they had still been a part of the SBC, just sort of given how schools in the SBC normally are in terms of accepting, students of different backgrounds and thoughts and viewpoints. It was a great liberal arts education.
And just a quick trivia point to folks who hear the word Paladin. If you are a Dungeons and Dragons nerd, you will also recognize the word Paladin. I was a Dungeons. It's imagine theater nerd, Dungeons and Dragons nerd. I see a bit of a trend appearing. So anyway, let's fast forward to more recent history. And you are part of an elite group of council members who are former staff members.
Yes.
So what do you think you bring to the table as a council member, having previously been a council staff?
Well, I think it's a lot. So first, for me, I'm not starting from scratch in terms of understanding, one, our agency structure, but then two, how sort of the council works from, hearings, markups, right? That wasn't necessarily new to me. I think it also brings an understanding of the work and what it means to do it and do it well. I was a committee director for 2 years. So I know what the performance oversight process looks like from a staffer perspective. I know what it looks like to have to actually put the budget together from a staffer perspective, from a committee perspective, and doing that work. And I think that, it affords me the ability to ask the different types of questions. I hate asking surface questions because I feel like there's so much more. And I think that, when you're a staffer, you have not the ability, but you have the time as well as the responsibility to sort of get in deep on some of the issues. And I think that will carry over for me as a council member, or at least I hope it will.
Right. Have you already had a moment where you had when I'm running this thing, I'm going to do things differently? Have you already had a moment where you've been able to implement one of those? I'm not going to ask the blah, blah, blah silly question, or I'm going to do the improved version of whatever. Do you have something come to mind for that?
Well, I mean, that's how it was sort of my approach for performance oversight. I think as a staffer, sometimes you get so, the hearings can be long, all of the different types of things. And you also recognize too, when sometimes agency directors might be filibustering you or not giving you a sort of direct answer. And I've been able to curtail that a little bit. But also I found too that agency directors, the good ones anyway, who are really trying to be savvy at this, right? They will well, let me give you a little bit of a history. So it takes up more of your time to, answer or ask questions. And I have stopped some people before. I'm like, hey guys, I used to work here. Or not only that I used to work here, but I also used to work for your particular agency. So I don't need the history. Let's just get into the meat. Which kind of thwarts their plans. But I do find that to be a little, trump card that I have that I can always pull when I feel like, well, let's go back to the beginning. Well, actually, I was here for the beginning, so we don't need to go back to the beginning. Just let's go back to the last couple of years here, and then go forward from there.
I also wonder how much is, when I was a kid and I was saying, as a parent, I'm never going to do that thing where you lick your finger and you take the dirt off your kid's face. And then you end up as a parent and you're like, I don't know what else to do. So I'm wondering.
I have a water source and you look like a crazy person. Yeah, no, I've done that.
Sit back as a staffer and be like, oh, if I was a council member, this is what I would do, X, Y, and Z. And then you get in the spot and you're like, oh, now I get why they do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is always easier in some ways to be behind the scenes because at the end of the day, your name is not on the vote. And I do recall sometimes when I was a staffer, not just for the council, but even when I was working in the Senate, feeling a level of frustration around how a certain member might have voted on a particular issue. And being a council member now, and not just, in particular being an at-large member, which I think is a little bit different than being a ward member in terms of the things that you have to contemplate and sort of the various perspectives that you have to kind of bring to the table. Every vote is not easy. There are some votes that are highly complicated. And not from a political perspective, but also from just okay, what does this mean in the long term? What does this mean for the good of the whole city, not just in this particular moment? And yeah, I think for a little bit of that now, I kind of feel like I want to give some elected officials grace. I say some because some of them are not worthy of it, sort of on the national level in terms of the decision making that they're making. But there's just so much to consider. There's so many pieces. And, I think that's one in terms of how folks vote, but also two, when you're a staffer, I focus on a couple of issues, right? When I was committee director for the Committee on Education, my focus was on the education agencies and public libraries. So I could very, narrowly focus. And now as a council member, people are expecting you to not just know about, the issue that you have a background in, which for me would be education and workforce, but they want you to be familiar with the stop sign situation on their corner, or, the development issue in their ward or their neighborhood, or the particular, backstory about some particular alley in their community. And frankly, it's just a lot of information that you just kind of have to keep in your head all at once. Sometimes I'm envious of my ward colleagues and they're like, you only have to focus on your ward. I have to literally know everything about the whole city. Cause you never know when you're going to meet someone. And that's their they want to feel like you have been paying attention to the particular issue that their neighborhood and community has been facing, regardless of the fact that every neighborhood and community wants the exact same thing.
Right. I mean, in terms of the complexity of issues, at the most recent legislative meeting, we had to vote on whether to use eminent domain to seize a plot of land slated to be a halfway house to make it a park. And I was just amazed. That just seems like such a perfect example, because in that vote, as you're a council member deciding it, you're expressing your views on how returning citizens should be treated. You're expressing your views on how eminent domain should be used, the need for urban parks, if 300 beds is too big for a shelter, if the subcontractor that's providing the shelter is a good subcontractor, how the Bureau of Prisons treats DC since we're not a state, how the citizens of Ward 7 are going to feel, how the businesses of Ward 7 are going to feel. You're in a relation with the Ward 7 council member. I'm on social media. There's good and bad in social media, but that one vote you'll get tagged as pro halfway house or anti halfway house. There's so much complexity in that one vote, and every vote you take, you need to bring that level of depth to your analysis. And I think folks don't necessarily get that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think what you brought up is a really good point to underscore too, right, Josh? I feel like in some cases, some situations, residents, constituents, the public, they have maybe, I would say, a quarter of the amount of facts about a situation than what we have, right? So you think it's easy based on the 4 things that you know about in terms of this particular issue, versus, as you named, there is actually 100 various things that have to sort of go into account there. And, I also think about history a lot. I think about legacy a lot. I think about what, I guess going back to your earlier question, I was the kind of nerd, and I think that has kind of continued in terms of wanting to be a lifelong learner, but also feeling, because I'm not a DC native, I have felt a responsibility since the day I moved to the city to learn more about the history of DC. And it's complex, right? It's complex in its relationship to the federal government. And some of the things that happened in the district back in the day are heartbreaking. And then you have to remind yourself, okay, we weren't electing our own government then, right? We had Congress people from Indiana and Oklahoma and Kansas who were making, decisions on behalf of the district, and therefore had a complete disregard, for the history and for the people who were here at the time. And you want to ensure, or at least I want to ensure, that the choices that I am making is not recreating some of that history. That we are trying to move in a better light. Also recognizing that decisions that we make impact generations in some cases. That vote about the eminent domain in Ward 7 Park, I think, is going to be one of those examples of it wasn't just an impact for a day. So, yeah.
And so Councilmember Grasso. So, are you still in touch with Councilmember Grasso?
Well, not in the way that I would have been before, ethics rules, because he's lobbying. We have a clean break because I don't want anyone, saying, he called me, and even though we were or we were talking about something else, that we brought up some particular council business. I don't even want that. So I will talk to him next year.
Yes, that is deeply smart. So you, in addition to your time with the council, you did have a roughly equal amount of time, I think, time-wise, with the Senate, working. Am I roughly right?
Well, so my time in the Senate was like my second tour of duty. So I spent time working for Senator Kagan from North Carolina when I.
Oh yeah, I'm leaving that out. Gotcha.
But yeah, my second tour of duty, yes, it was 4 years.
Gotcha. With Chuck Schumer, who is never in the news, so low-key, low-profile member of Congress.
Nobody knows him.
No. How was that transition, going from a body that we constantly yell at and don't have representation in to being part of that body?
It's because I had been in federal government before, it wasn't like a crazy transition. Although there were definitely some adjustments. So for instance, also working in leadership, which is completely different. Senator Schumer doesn't sit on any committees as sort of a regular member. So hearings are not a thing that we got to prepare you for this hearing and do all these questions and XYZ. Like, that's not something that we do. Mm-hmm. But also in a leadership role, a lot of our work was around how do we take care of our members? How do we ensure that our members are able to be successful legislatively? And how do we craft, the messaging for the caucus? What Senate Democrats are going to talk about in terms of, these particular issues, et cetera. But, there were definitely, it was the Trump years, right? Being in the Senate in the minority during the Trump years brings its own level of frustration, because you're dealing with a White House that in some ways doesn't believe in government, and yet they're running it. Right. Or they don't know how it works, and yet they're running it. So a lot of frustration and a lot of frustrating pieces, but we got to do some pretty cool stuff that actually surprised me that we actually got it done. But really exciting time.
And do you have, even in the back of your head, any regrets that now that Schumer's in the majority and is able to accomplish many, but not all the things he wants to, that you're over here on the local side?
Not at all. Not at all. I feel like, one of the big things that happened even pre-pandemic that we were able to get done, that I was able to convince the senator to be for, is we got the largest increase in the Child Care Development Block Grant in history, right? Well, that was pre-pandemic, but at that time it was almost more than double what the current funding was. And that felt really good, right? It felt like we moved in the right direction. And frankly, that investment that we had, I think, enabled our childcare sector to not completely fall apart during the pandemic because we had already made this historic investment. And I kind of view it as like you were planting little seeds that now you get to see grow.
Right.
So we were planting seeds in terms of childcare, which is now sort of taken off. I was able to work on paid family leave policies, specifically, ideally it would have been for all workers, but we were able to get 12 weeks of paid family leave done for all federal employees. To get something like that done during, the Trump administration, or even just during like McConnell being leader, where there wasn't a lot of legislation happening, that was great. And now to hear my colleagues talking about, and we're going to continue to push for all workers. I did a lot of work on higher education and student loan debt. Worked a lot with my colleagues in Senator Murray's office and Senator Warren's office to get the caucus together on, the idea around canceling up to $50,000 of student loan debt. And frankly, when I turn on the news and I see, Chuck and Senator Warren still talking about it, I feel good because that means that the work that I didn't just go, be shoved in a drawer. Now you're a majority leader. All the work that we laid, all the foundation that we laid, you can go ahead and go do that stuff now. And so I feel like I'm still a part of it, even though I'm not there for the day-to-day.
Gotcha. And then you're also implementing whatever does happen, hopefully positive things moving forward. Whatever does happen, you'll be part of making them real on the local level.
Right.
Now, do you feel that Chuck Schumer is Mitch McConnell's match in terms of procedural mastery and by any means necessary accomplishment of his goals?
The difference is not, I think, like Chuck versus Mitch. What I view as McConnell's power was that he had a caucus that was willing to say yes, no matter what, without question, 100% of the time, ish, right? What we have on the Senate Democrat side, everybody, first of all, is not ideologically aligned, right? So if you think about Senate Republicans, okay, Lindsey Graham and Rob Portman, you squint a little, they're about the same as a Rand Paul on some issues, right? In terms of votes, in terms of policy, they are equally to say no on most things. When you look at the Democrats on the other side, though, you gotta manage a Joe Manchin to a Bernie Sanders. It is much harder for us to get the entire caucus to say yes or no 100% of the time. And I think that is the key difference between the type of quote unquote power that McConnell versus Schumer wield. Frankly, I would say Mitch has it easier because he has a caucus who's willing to just go along to get along. We have it harder because we have a caucus who is willing to ask questions, but also wants to remain authentic to their voice as opposed to being fake and saying I'm with something when I'm not. Does that make things harder? Yeah, but does it make government better because multiple viewpoints have a seat at the table, whereas before that was not the case? Sure.
Yeah. And it seems like with the reconciliation stuff that's been in the news, they are working the rules every last way they can. When I saw the headline about the parliamentarian ruling on the reconciliation trial, I was like, oh, yeah. Things have changed. I thought that the parliamentarian would say no to that. I think there is going to have to be some type of come to Jesus conversation because the idea that one senator could hold up voting rights for the entire country. Do you want to be that person in history? That's really the question I would ask Joe Manchin. Do you want to be that person who was so committed to a rule to protect the voice of a minority in the Senate that you don't want to protect the voice of the minorities in the country?
I wouldn't want to live with that type of legacy. But frankly, I think that's the type of conversation that they're going to have with him on this. Yeah. And Kristen Sinema, for that matter.
Now, I want to throw out, we're starting to run a little short on time. Throwing out a couple combo questions.
Okay.
One is compare David Grasso to Chuck Schumer as a boss.
No.
And also, I want you to throw in any little fun details we wouldn't know about Schumer or Grasso that you happen to know. Like, oh, they love combos, or man, they can't get enough Grand Funk Railroad, or like.
Yeah.
Some trivia and some boss comparison.
Okay, so boss comparisons, they're very different. But I also think it was because of like the size of the office, right? So a council office, you have maybe 6 or 7 people who are working, but if you add the committee staff, it's a little bit more. The Schumer operation is more than 100 people deep. And that's including all of the various offices in state, et cetera. So, you know, Chuck was one that like when we take recess, we take recess. David was more or less like, yes, it's recess hours, but you're still going to be here 9 to 5:30. Like it was a normal day, which I think is just a function of the differences in terms of government types of things. Let's see. Senator Schumer has a sweet tooth, but I think people kind of know that. And I don't think Grasso had one in terms of like a sweet tooth, if you will. Grasso is definitely more outdoorsy, willing to go off-roading, camping, etc. That is not a Schumer. But
he grew up on a farm, so that, you know.
Excuse me. I mean, yeah, Chuck is from Brooklyn. So, you know, camping and that kind of stuff is just not really in his
not in his wheelhouse.
It's not in his wheelhouse. But, you know, I think they both have a similar passion, though, for the work and for public good and public safety. And, you know, it's just a different type of someone who's been a legislator for 30 plus years versus someone who was a legislator for 8. You know, they just have different perspectives on that they're bringing to the work.
Now, to get us up to your current point, we talked about your stint with David Grasso, your stint with Chuck Schumer. Let's talk about that crazy election that you came through with that number of candidates, virtual election. What do you think you learned from that election? How did it make you a better council member?
Well, there's so much. I mean, I think for listeners, first off, right. You know, I announced that I was running in November of 2019. So this was pre-pandemic. So my expectation and anticipation of what the election would look like was very different than what it turned out. We had to sort of change course midway through things. I think when things first shut down in March, like many people, we thought, okay, it'll be a couple of weeks and then we'll get back to it. And then a couple of weeks turned into a month, and then a month turned into 2 months. And then, you know, the council had to change some rules around, you know, how we're going to do some things in terms of the election, just to make it accessible to people in the middle of a pandemic. One of the things that, you know, running against 23 other people definitely taught me is that you need to be clear and concise in terms of your messaging. Because when we would do forums, right, like you get 60 seconds to answer a question. You don't get 3 to 5 minutes to explain your position on things. So you have to like whittle it down. It has to be tight, and you have to like get to your point across, or enough of your point across so that people might be interested in wanting to go to your website and read more, or come to a town hall that you're just doing with yourself and learn more, to be able to ask questions, that kind of stuff. But also too, I realized that there are lots of DC residents who still like a personal touch, but not too close of a personal touch, right? So we didn't do traditional canvassing because I felt uncomfortable in creating a space that would make it, one, safe for both the volunteer, but also for the resident. And I also was just trying to think of like, when we think about where we were a year ago, people were like, I'm wearing gloves, I'm wearing masks, I don't want to like have any unnecessary contact with someone I don't need to have contact with. So the idea of somebody like randomly coming up to your door and it wasn't with an Amazon package to like knock and have a conversation, like I felt like that was just going to go completely poorly. But we did basically contactless canvassing, which was like a lit drops. So we had door hangers and volunteers would literally like go to the door, would leave the hanger and then go. And I've heard from so many people that they appreciated that type of effort and touch where it wasn't just mail, but like you literally came to my door and you left something here for me and, that kind of stuff. So like, that's something to sort of keep in mind too. I don't know how elections are going to be in the future. Obviously I don't anticipate that there will be as many candidates that ran. But there are definitely some changes that will happen. I think some organizations actually liked the Zoom meeting effect because more people in the community could participate. And it didn't require like, oh, I have to book a space and I have to make sure we have a mic and I have to do all of these other things, right? It literally was like, do you have a laptop? Do you have an internet connection? Like, can you get on? And frankly, as a candidate, it meant that I could do multiple things in one night because I didn't have to drive all over the city. Right. I literally was like, okay, off on Zoom. Let me click on to the next one. I could get, I was able to hit a lot more ground in that way, but it was a crazy experience.
Now, one more thing on the elections. Talk to me about the post endorsement, but talk to me about the logistics of the post endorsement. Like, how many people do you interview with? What questions do they ask you? How long does it take? How long after you do the interview, do you find out? I want to know the like behind the scenes of the post.
Well, so this was I was a first time candidate. So frankly, I didn't know much about the process. I could ask other people in terms of like, okay, is this about the time that it happens? What should I be doing in sort of the advance of these types of things? Because, I think most people who keep up with DC politics know that like the post editorial board, as it pertains to political endorsements, has a track record and a particular history. But for me, with 23 other candidates and being a first-time candidate, and also taking into account too that every registered voter in the district was going to get a ballot, right? That changes literally everything about how you think about who is your quote unquote audience and who is your quote unquote voter. I needed the post endorsement more than anybody else, probably, just in terms of like exposure and that stamp of validation that I wasn't getting from, some of the community organizations who had already picked their candidate, sort of en masse, if you will. So I think there was a call to schedule. It was like a invitation call, like we like to interview you. And then there was the interview. And then, it's like a 45 minutes to an hour conversation on a variety of things, right? Tell me your background, tell me your, why you're running. And then, questions on particular issues that pop up, et cetera. And then that's it. And then you don't know. There is no follow-up conversation. There is no other pieces. And I had no idea when it was coming, to be frank. It was up one morning. We were about to go out and do a lit drop in Shepherd Park in Ward 4, which is not far from my house. And I was feeding my daughter breakfast. We're just like getting ready for the day. And a friend texted on a group chat and was like, are we not going to talk about this? And I was like, what are we talking about? And she dropped the link in the chat. And the first thing I saw was my picture. And I was like, what is going on? and that's how I found out. And my husband has like some footage and slash photographs. Like my hair wasn't done. It was like me and my kid, and we're eating breakfast in the morning, and I'm like, we're sitting, to get ready for the day. And you have this sort of bombshell thing that kind of hits. And yeah, I won't get into the.
What was the gap between the interview and getting that group text? Like weeks or days?
No, it was a few weeks. It was a few weeks. And frankly, I don't or didn't know or how many people the Post was talking to. So, there's 24 people on the ballot. I don't know. I had to guess that they probably weren't going to talk to everybody, but like, I didn't know how many. So I just was like, okay, I did my part. I did as best I thought I could do. And then like, I just need to focus in on the race. Cause if it doesn't happen, I still have to have like an action plan here in terms of, getting my name out there and kind of doing the work, if you will. And, the significant piece about the picture was because earlier in the campaign, the Post had done a story about what they considered to be sort of the top tier candidates. And I was interviewed for that story. I saw the online version and thought it was, fine, whatever. And then I started getting calls from people the next day who were like, oh my God, have you seen the Post? And I was like, yeah, I saw it last night. It's fine. They're like, no, have you seen the print version? And for your listeners, I was the only female candidate who was featured in that story. But in the print version of the article, I was the only one whose picture they did not print. They only printed a picture of the men, and that became its own thing. So for them to put my picture up there, it was kind of like okay, guys, I see what you're trying to do.
Well, yeah. Well, because they eventually ran a correction, on like B13 at the bottom of the page where they did include your picture.
Yeah, but it was an op-ed that someone had actually submitted, basically calling them out on it. And, so it was like a whole thing, but that was a great day. It was rainy, but it was a great day.
And did you come out of the interview thinking you had a decent, or you'd improved your chances, or you had a very good shot, or were you totally had no clue where they were coming out of the interview?
I honestly had no clue because, even though there were 2 seats available, I didn't know how many people that they would choose to endorse, if they would choose to endorse anyone, right? I mean, I think I've been in politics enough and have watched how this happens enough, right? A local paper could pull a curveball and say, we're not going to do anybody. Or, earlier that year with, who was it? The New York Times for the presidential. They pulled a curveball as opposed to just endorsing one person, one Democratic candidate. They endorsed 2. So like it could have gone either way. I felt comfortable in that I was myself. I answered the questions. I presented a case as to why I thought I would be a great council member a better council member than, the folks who were running, and why I felt like I deserved the opportunity to prove that. But there was no feeling of like, oh yeah, I got this. No, not at all. I didn't feel that way throughout this entire election, frankly. And even on election night, that was like I didn't know what was going to happen. I had no inclination in terms of going in. I knew that I could kind of be there, but my biggest thing, and I would tell like my friends, like, I just don't want to embarrass myself. I don't want to get like 250 votes. And if we can exceed that, I'm going to call that like a win or something. I don't know.
And I mean, so many council members have to run and lose at least once before they make it over the hump. So
I just like lowered expectations. I just was like, okay, we'll see what happens. And frankly, I was actually kind of glad that at that point, like we couldn't do any parties in person. So like you could only sort of do things virtually, but I was like, great, because if election night turns out horribly, not just for myself or for the presidency and for the whole 9, I could just like go to bed and nobody know. As opposed to if you're in person at a party and you still have to like talk to guests and act cheerful. I didn't want any of that. So, thank you, pandemic, for that one little
Yeah, you need that silver lining sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time. We're going to do our one last question that we always do in the first round. I have to get my prop out.
Oh.
You learn a lot by people about people by having them rank dessert categories. That's what I've learned in life. So I've asked every council member I've ever interviewed for the show, so all of them,
Okay.
to rank these desserts. There we go.
Okay.
Cake, candy, cookies, ice cream, and pie. So I want you to rank those from top to bottom, 1 to 5, your favorite to your least favorite.
Okay. Ice cream is number 1. I'm an ice cream fiend. Candy would probably have to be number 2. Oh, that's so bad. I hope my dentist is not listening. Then cookies, then cake, then pie.
We are dessert twins.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
You have. I have to check the list.
Did any of my colleagues say like pie first? Because then I have questions.
Well, the funny thing is the 2 who say pie first, and you're going to laugh, the chairman and Alyssa Silverman. And the chairman, it's worse, and I always bring this up, not just pie, rhubarb pie. Yeah. So he's disqualified from any votes on dessert at council.
This is actually really good for us to know, because if we ever in life have a council potluck, the chairman will never be allowed to sign up for dessert, because he will bring a rhubarb pie and it will sit there.
Yeah, exactly. And I just checked, and I do have a spreadsheet. I just checked my spreadsheet, and you are unique among council members.
Am I?
You and I are dessert twins, but there's no other, so you can't build a coalition around people that have your same dessert profile.
Okay.
You got to start from scratch.
Fine. Sometimes you got to stand out and be an individual. And I'm willing to, back up my claims very specifically.
Yeah,
I feel very strongly about the way I rank those.
Yeah, you can build a coalition. Ice cream first is Anita Bonds, Brianna Doe, Brooke Pinto, Vince Gray, and Treyon White. Okay,
good.
So that could be the ice cream coalition. You need to get them around a table once things are back to normal.
Yeah, I think I there were times where I thought perhaps I was the only person who was like buying ice cream in the dead of winter, but there is ice cream in my house literally year round.
Yeah.
Usually multiple flavors.
Treyon White's answer to the question was my favorite, in that he said this is when we were still at the radio station, he had 3 of them in his car at the moment of the interview. That won me over big time. I
can't do that, but like the freezer is right here, but it's okay. Yeah.
That's true. Well, sadly, we are out of time. Thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties earlier. Thank you for putting the time aside for the interview. And I just want to remind our listeners to subscribe to our podcast, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. Search for Hearing the Council. Thanks again for joining us. Tune in next time. We're on DC Radio 96.3 FM HD4 or dcradio.gov. And as always, I'm Josh Gibson, and this is not a council hearing. This is Hearing the Council. Thanks very much, council member. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Eventually.
In DC, for DC, DC Radio, 96.3 HD4 and dcradio.gov.